Good morning. Welcome to episode 17 of Tea, Coffee, and Torah. I'm glad to have you with me this morning. We have been talking about the use of marijuana in Israel's high places. And we've been talking about the historical context. One of the things that I advocate for is that you can't understand much of Scripture until you understand the world in which the prophets and the chronicles, whether you're looking at the chronicle for the administration or you're looking at the Levitical scribe who recorded Israel's history, unless you step back into history and you have a frame of reference regarding what the prophet is talking about, you're going to end up and derive at conclusions that are totally alien to what the author had in mind. So before we can criticize the text, before we can advocate for the text, we first need to clarify and define what that text is even talking about. So we have been in Isaiah 66. We have talked about verse 2, verse 3, and we have shown, or at least I have shown, from the known Hittite text, how Isaiah is actually criticizing a Hittite ritual that was very likely inherited by the Canaanites. Well, we're going to just continue to discuss this, and we are now at the time of King Ahaz. King Ahaz, it's very kind of foggy. What you find in Israel's history is that during their very righteous episodes of history, you find that the scribes are meticulous in recording the specifics of history. During times where there's an unrighteous king, where there is not so much liberty, you find that the scribes, the chroniclers, they don't really care so much for history. It kind of falls into disuse. It's not as popular. So what I want to read about, and I am going to be doing a little bit of reading this morning, just because these verses are so overlooked. They're there and we just kind of skip over them, maybe because they have no relevance to us today. But it really has a lot of relevance for the book of Isaiah, like the entire book of Isaiah. Much of Jeremiah is actually discusses the implications of what Ahaz did, as does Hezekiah's reforms. Actually, what Ahaz did necessitates Hezekiah's reforms that we find archaeologically, that we find recorded in Scripture. So I want to just dig right into what it states. And with one caveat, I think that we have to be very careful. There is a tendency today in modern source criticism to only focus on kings or only focus on chronicles and say that, well, this author didn't know anything about this over here. But when you look at both the story of Kings and Chronicles together, you find that it actually totally coincides with what we know archaeologically, as well as what we find in Assyrian annals, in their official records of state. So when we take all three of them together, you find they're actually all telling the same story. And I don't think that there's anything that, anciently, whether we look at ancient Egypt and their history writing, everybody had formulas for writing, like specific ways that you would make an entry. You couldn't you put it in your own words and say, oh, this is what happened. No, there were coded phrases. There were specific formulas you had to follow when you were making an entry into a official record of state, whether it was on the Levitical side or whether it was on the Judah side as far as the palace was concerned. There were very specific formulas and very specific ways in which those entries had to be made. So we're going to look at both Kings and Chronicles and look at what happened to the worship of Yahweh. Look at what happened to the temple in Jerusalem during the days of King Ahaz. So I'm going to take a swig of coffee. Yes, I'm still on coffee. As they say, coffee is the liquor of the Bible. It's known as Hebrews, so it's very biblical there. Sorry, that was another dad joke. So I just want to point out some of the things that Ahaz did during his reign. Now, Ahaz is kind of a tough thing to nail down. As I mentioned in episode 16, Uzziah had reigned for 52 years. This would have been Ahaz's grandfather. And his long reign really presented an issue for succession. Jotham would have been so old, and he actually co-reigned with his father Uzziah for a while, because Uzziah, which we'll get into another episode, had committed the sin of trying to usurp the rights of the high priest and to burn incense. Now, Uzziah tried to burn the incense, the holy incense that was described within the Torah. And because of that, he became a leper. He had to live in a completely separate house, and his son Jotham really inherited the administration of state. It was a co-regency. We're not told how long. I have reconstructed that in my book, Yahweh Exists. If you're interested, if you want to see that, you go to academia.edu. I do have the chronology chapter in my book uploaded, so you can read it there. And you can see the co-regency that Jotham had with Uzziah. Now, because Jotham was so old, it appears also that Ahaz, very early in Jotham's reign, began a co-regency. And a lot of these cultic issues, a lot of this desecration began to occur, probably as Jotham was old. He may have even been senile. We don't know. But whatever it was, Ahaz began to assert more and more power, and he began to assert that power with regard to the temple in Jerusalem. So this is what scripture states, and this is going to be from both Kings and Chronicles. He made his sons pass through the fire. This is something that we know from Carthage. We know that human sacrifice was a big issue, or became a big issue during this time period. He followed the abominations of the heathen, whom Yahweh cast out before Israel. He sacrificed and burnt incense in the high places, under every green tree and in every hill. That is both Kings and Chronicles refer to that. Chronicles tells us he made a molten image for Balaam. He sacrificed to the gods of Damascus after he was defeated by Syria and Israel. Now, the story of Isaiah 7 really comes to play with this too. And we're not going to get into it so much this time, but the historical context that Isaiah gives us really gives us a lot of background information. The beginning of Isaiah chapter 7, and I know everyone is so focused on Emmanuel and the prophecies of Emmanuel in chapter 7 that we really overlook the important history that determines those prophecies. So we can't really just focus on one thing to the exclusion of everything else, because then we lose the meaning entirely. So when you look at the beginning of Isaiah chapter 7, as well as the story that's in Kings, you find that both of us tell us that very early on, and this was probably when Ahaz was still co-regent with his father Jotham, that it was discovered there was this confederacy between Syria, which would have been modern day Damascus, as well as the northern kingdom of Israel. They had become confederates, and they had this plan to conquer Jerusalem, to insert their own monarch or their own vassal in Jerusalem, and to join this alliance that was opposing Assyria, because Assyrian was becoming this world power. They were steamrolling, they were conquering territories, and there was this alliance with Egypt where they were going to withstand Assyria. Well, what we find is very early, whether we look at Isaiah 7 or 2 Kings chapter 16, is that very early Ahaz had success. And that ingress, that assault was defeated. It was withstood by Judah. But then you find Ahaz totally turns from Yahweh. He totally turns to cultic practices. And that initial victory is very short-lived, because then indeed Assyria Syria, not Assyria, Syria and the northern kingdom of Israel do indeed defeat Judah. And then that is when Ahaz goes to all out paganism. But before this, we find from Isaiah chapter 7 that very early on that Ahaz rebuffed Yahweh. He rebuffed any sign that Ahaz offered for Yahweh being with Ahaz, for walking in Yahweh's ways. Ahaz says, no, thank you. I don't want any of it. But let's look specifically at what Ahaz did, because this really sets the stage for what's going to happen with Hezekiah, for what was going to happen with Josiah, and what is going to happen with Jeremiah and his criticisms of the temple cult, not just in Jerusalem, but also in all the other high places. It's kind of funny because, as we saw at Tel El-Rod, marijuana becomes the incense of paganism. It's really the incense of cult. So when we read high places in the Bible modernly, and this is just the irony of where, you can't make this stuff up, because the irony in this is that these high places in the 8th century actually become places to get high. When that term high places was entered into the original text, King James Version very early on, it was just simply because they were usually places of higher altitude. It was thought that if you were in a high hill, you were closer to God. But it's just kind of irony the way this kind of comes full circle. So let's read exactly what Ahaz does to the tabernacle, to the temple in Jerusalem. It says, and this is 2 Kings 16, verses 10 through 18. It says, and King Ahaz went to Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and saw there an altar that was in Damascus. And King Ahaz sent to Uriah the priest the fashion of this altar and the pattern of it according to all the workmen thereof. And Uriah the priest built this altar according to all that King Ahaz had sent him from Damascus. So the priest made it before King Ahaz returned from Damascus. So Ahaz had gone to Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser. Previously, he had sought Tiglath-Pileser for help, and we know both from Chronicles as well as from Pulitser's own archives that he sacked Damascus. He totally deported Rezin, its king. He says, only the town of Samaria did I leave. So not only was Syria deported, but you also find that much of the northern kingdom of Israel is deported. Specifically mentioned is Naphtali. Isaiah will also refer to this. It talks about the vexation of Naphtali was not as it was before. But it is this instance, and the hard thing when you are looking back in history for us today, all these events are kind of like telescoped into this one single event because we're looking back in history. But if you would have been living there and you would have read through the book of Isaiah, you would have read through Chronicles, you would have seen the subtlety of, oh, well, this was this campaign. Oh, well, here a few verses later, this is a separate campaign. And you would have known the historical context. So a lot of this is perspective of when we look back in time. To us, it seems like a singular event today, but back in the historical frame, the historical context, it would have been probably 3-4 campaigns and separate events that occurred all probably within about maybe a 10-year, 15-year period. But let's return to what Ahaz did to the temple in Jerusalem, because it is absolutely horrific. And we are not today, but we are going to come back to Uriah the priest, because he does become a controversial figure, because he does do these things for King Ahaz. We're not going to have time to get into that today. Today we are going to go a little bit longer than probably the 20 minutes that I try to keep it to, because I want to cover all this information. All right, so let's go back to, I am in 2 Kings 16, verse 12, if you want to follow along. It says, and when the king was come from Damascus, he saw the altar, and the king approached the altar, and he offered upon it. And he burnt the offering of his grain offering, and poured his drink offering, and sprinkled the blood of his peace offering upon the altar. Now, before I get to 14, let me give you just a little bit of a background with the brazen altar. The brazen altar is described in Exodus 27 and 28. It was an altar of brass that was fashioned by Bezalel in the wilderness. Okay, hopefully I'm still here. I got a notice of a poor connection. Hopefully it did not time out. This brazen altar derives from the Exodus period. When Israel was in the wilderness, this is before Israel, while Israel is at Mount Sinai, before they begin their wilderness journeys again. Well, you find that Ahaz builds this altar that he saw in Damascus for the people to sacrifice on. And we also learn from 2 Chronicles 28 verses 23 that King Ahaz begins to sacrifice to the gods of Damascus after he was defeated by Syria and Israel. Well, then he takes this brazen altar, the one that was original from the Exodus, that was incorporated into Solomon's temple. And Solomon, of course, refashioned some of these things. He repurposed them for the temple setting. So it went from the tabernacle to the temple, something that was a more permanent structure. But in verse 14, it says that Ahaz brought the brazen altar, which was before Yahweh, from the forefront of the house, from between the altar of the house of Yahweh, and put it on the north side of this new altar. And King Ahaz commanded Uriah the priest, saying, upon the great altar burn the morning burnt offering and the evening grain offering, and the king's burnt sacrifice and his meat offering, with the burnt offering for the people of the land, and their meat offering, and their drink offering, and sprinkle upon it the blood of the burnt offering, and the blood of the sacrifice, and the brazen altar shall be for me to inquire by. So Ahaz takes this brazen altar for his own. He confiscates it. So now, basically, the priests no longer have access to what would have been traditionally the altar that all the sacrifices would have been burned on. And this is kind of a significant point because this altar was never supposed to have the fat or the blood actually burned on it. You know, those were used for different purposes. The fat was always burned with the incense, and then the blood was sprinkled at the base of the altar. So now it appears that Ahaz is reserving this brazen altar for seeking guidance, perhaps by following the pagan practice of consulting entrails. What we do know is that pagan practices began to displace Yahwistic practices. He begins to dismantle all of the artifacts, all of the temple implements that served for the official Levitical service at the temple in Jerusalem. Specifically, and I'm going to show you this before I tell you about this. This is going to be from my book. Let me see if you can see this. Do you see this? This is the laver. This is called the brazen sea. This is what the priest would bathe in before they went for their service in the temple. Now, notice that there are oxen at the base of this. In my book, and this is, if you're looking at this is from Yahweh Exists, Volume 1. In my book, I do propose that the symbolism of the oxen, the three to the north, three to the south, the west, and the east, it symbolized Israel's future diaspora that would occur. Well, and in some ways, Ahaz's actions really are symbolic of this era, because there is this idea that when you have something and you modify it, it activates it. It makes it where it's going to happen in that day. And that's what Ahaz does. He takes this laver, this sea of 2,000 baths. He takes the oxen away from it, and he sets it on simple pavement stones. So this idea that he's kind of activating the prophecy by his actions are kind of symbolic. It's something that's very foreign to us today, but this is how things were understood in their ancient historical context. So Ahaz totally strips from the temple. He takes the vessels from the temple. He takes anything of value, anything of worth. He cuts it up. He takes the sea And what does he use the brass for? Does he melt the brass down and use it for his idols that he creates? That's one possibility. He may even repurpose these oxen that are underneath the sea into some sort of pagan deity. Baal himself is represented as an ox. So he could have been taken, what was in one point a tabernacle and temple context that had a non-pagan usage and reappropriated it. You also find that during the king's era, there was this conduit from the king's house to the Temple Mount, where there was this courtyard for the king to sit on the Sabbath, probably to hear the Torah. It was some sort of covered pavilion. Some scholars say that this was like a safe passageway where if you were under enemy attack and there were arrows, you could be sheltered, and the king could still come to the tabernacle or to the temple and perform his Sabbath duties. It's really, because this is the only text that we have in the entire Tanakh that refers to it, or the Old Testament. The Tanakh is another name for the Old Testament. Because this is the only reference that we have to it, there's a lot of speculation as to exactly what this pavilion for the Sabbath day for the king entailed. What is very, very likely is that it was probably some sort of shelter that the king, some sort of canopy that the king sat while the priest read the daily Torah reading, or whatever portion was read for the Sabbath day. Maybe he was there and he listened to the choir that would sing with its refrains and responses. So Hezekiah also seals up the passageway that would have gone to the temple, and he turns it away. It says that he does this for the king of Assyria. So he really takes everything that was cultic at this time period, and he really pacifies the king of Assyria with everything that he does. So he takes away any context of a Sabbath, anything that would have separated Israel and their cultic endeavors from Assyria. And he really makes it something that is very modernized, something that is very vogue for the Assyrian king, who he is trying to pacify. He's trying to win Tiglath-Pileser's favor. He's trying to say, hey, we can adapt. We are very, very much like you. And this is not unlike what Afghanistan or Iraq or Africa or any country today does when it is trying to seek the favor of the United States or NATO. They will often adopt a lot of our practices, a lot of our policies of the Western world in order to show, hey, we are willing to work with you. And it appears that is exactly what Ahaz does. So he takes these original cultic implements and he modifies them. And he strips them. He utterly strips them. But then this is what I found was very, very interesting. And this is something that I find that, I have read over many, many times before. In 2 Chronicles 28, verse 24, it says, "And Ahaz gathered together the vessels of the house of God and cut in pieces the vessels. And he shut the doors of the house of Yahweh and made him altars in every corner in Jerusalem." This shutting the doors of the house of Yahweh very likely refers to the shuttering of the temple in Jerusalem. He closed it down. The doors were shut. The Levites were cast out of office. They were totally banned from performing their normal cultic duties. And the pagan practices of Ahaz begin to totally displace anything that occurred during the time of David and Solomon and Asa. Now paganism is a function of state. And this is, and it's now not so ironic that we find when we look at Tel El-Rod that the high day of this high place at Tel El-Rod occurs and coincides directly with Ahaz shuttering the temple in Jerusalem, beginning to install all these pagan practices. It says that he takes his incense altars and he puts it in every corner of Jerusalem, rather than this cult being something that is protected and insulated so that foreign influences, foreign ideologies and doctrines cannot attach themselves to this, the temple in Jerusalem, well, now everything becomes a cultic practice that is practiced by the people. The people are very much involved in what their religion is going to be. The people are very much involved in what they are going to be doing with burning this incense, something that was reserved for only the high priest. Now the people have access. It's, you know, every man can do what's right in his own eyes. And, you know, Jerusalem really becomes a place where I'm sure there were a lot of good times, and people saw a lot of good things underneath the influence of this incense. So I wanted to today mainly establish what the damage that Ahaz did to the temple in Jerusalem, how it was probably at this point in time, you know, if we take all the information that we have, that the Levites were probably cast from the Levitical service. And this is when, again, we know archaeologically, the temple at Tel El-Rod begins to flourish with both an altar for Yahweh and another altar for a pagan deity, likely Asherah. So we are going to return to this discussion. We're going to get more into the high places. We're going to also discuss Uriah, because Uriah becomes this problematic figure, at least according to modern sensibilities, as to what his hand was in fashioning this altar from Damascus. You know, there is some view from scholars that because Ahaz took away the images of the oxen underneath the bath, that he was actually getting rid of some sort of pagan cultic influence. But you really start to have to pick and choose your verses. Like you say, okay, I'm going to go with this verse, I'm going to discredit this verse. So you really begin to kind of make your own assumption or your own theories when you don't take them as a whole. And then when you don't compare that whole to what we know in Assyrian and other records from other states that also shed light on this record of this time period. So anyway, thank you for joining me this morning. We did go a little bit over, and we will get into this a little bit deeper on our next episode. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining me. If you have any contributions, any insights, I would love to hear them. Please drop me a line. Share your perspective in the notes, in the comments below, and I will be sharing more articles. We are going to be looking at other high places. Tel El-Rod is not the only high place we're going to be looking at in this series. So have a fantastic day, and thank you so much.